everyone, this is Mindy and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm creating this holiday card using some new products from Pretty Pink Posh. I'm going to start with a stenciled background using the Winter Foliage stencil from Pretty Pink Posh. This is a 3-layer stencil. The first one is for the branches and the pine cones. The second one has the leaves and pine needles. And the third one has the berries. I'm starting with a piece of white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I just rolled up some Post-it tape and placed it on the back so that I could adhere it to my work surface. And then I'm adding the stencil and I'm holding that down with some masking tape. I'm also putting some in that top left corner so that I can align it perfectly each time. I'm starting with the first layer of the stencil, and for this I'm adding the color Chocolate Truffle from Gina K Designs using a blending brush. Once I have that whole background covered, I can lift that up, and then I'm using that masking tape up in the corner to make sure that my pine needles are lined up correctly over that branch. Now to do this, I'm starting with the first layer, and that's going to be light spruce. So I am adding 2 layers of color to this. This is going to be my lightest layer, and then once I have this down, I'm coming in with another color. Now this is dark spruce, and I'm using a very small blending brush just to add this darker color to the pine needles. That really helps step up our stencils and make it look like there's really more to it than there was. I'm going to cover all of the pine needles, then remove my masking tape and lift that up, and this has got to be my favorite stencil so far this year. Now I went ahead and lined up the third layer of the stencil, and for this part, the berries, I am using cherry red. Now I'm going to go back to the second layer. Now each layer has A, B, and C. So this is layer B. I had cleaned this off. This is the stencil with the pine needles, but I wanted to kind of frost the pine needles a little bit, and I'm using Distress Grit Paste in Snowfall. I'm using the tip of my spatula and just adding that to the pine needles. This is really going to give it that wintry feel. So after I remove my stencil, I'll give you a close-up look at how this is looking so far, and then I'm going to wash off my stencil in the sink and work on the second part of my card, which is the stamping and coloring. So while that's drying, I'm going to bring out the holiday envelopes stamp set and also the pine wreath. So this is the holiday envelopes, and then I'm going to use the bow from the pine wreath stamp set. I stamped the images in black Copic friendly ink onto some white cardstock, and I'm coloring them with my Copic markers. So for the bow and also the flowers, I'm using R59, R39, and R35. Now for the actual bow part, I'm using that darkest color, the R59, just adding kind of those flicks right into where the bow is tied, and then I'm going to blend it out with the rest of the colors. So it's not a very smooth blend. I really wanted to have those flicks to kind of show where that bow gets tightened up in the middle. Now for the parts that are hanging down, I have the darkest color towards the inside of the bow and then blending those out. I really like using this color combination for my bow and flowers because that dark color just really stands out and helps emphasize those shadow areas. Now for my flowers, this one gets a little bit more tedious because the flowers are kind of small, but what I'm doing is taking my darkest color and I'm adding it to just one side of the petal. Now there's a couple different ways you could really color these poinsettias. So I'm doing it where I'm adding a shadow onto one side of each petal, but you could also start with adding flicks from the center and flicking it out towards the edge of the petal. So kind of 2 different ways depending how you want to color them. I just found this to be the easiest for me at that time. Now that R35, my lightest color, is really going to step up that highlight area since my other 2 colors are super dark. This one just kind of really packs in that punch of adding that highlight area. And then I'm also going to use it for the berries on my leaves. For the leaves on my poinsettias, I'm using G28, G07, and YG06. Since my flower's kind of dark, I kept my leaves kind of dark. But for the leaves on my berries, my holly berries, I'm going to use a little bit lighter of a color combination, and that one is going to be just using the G07, YG06, and YG01, just to have some kind of difference between the leaves and the holly. After these are colored in, then I have that pine cone in there. And for that, I'm just using two different browns. I have E57 and E55, adding that darkest color to just one side, doesn't matter which one. And then I wanted to add a little bit of color to the envelope. I didn't want it to be stark white. So for this, I'm using B000, and then I'm going to blend that out with the B000. I'm also going to add a little bit of this lightest color in between the poinsettias and the holly. Once everything is completely colored in, I'm taking the coordinating dies, lining them up, and I'm going to hold that down with just this masking tape and run these through my die cut machine. Now, my background is fairly dry at this point, so I'm going to trim this down with my paper trimmer. This panel is going to end up measuring about 4 by 5.25, and I wanted to pop it up a little bit onto a card base. Before I do that, I'm going to add a piece of white cardstock that measures that same size. To me, this kind of helps give more stability to my panel, and then I can add foam tape behind it without the foam tape really showing through. Sometimes I notice when I add foam tape to the back of my panels, I can see where the open areas are, and I don't like that look. So by adding that extra panel of cardstock there, that really helped kind of hide the foam tape. The sentiment I'm going to use comes from the Holiday Envelopes stamp set. There's a couple of them on there. And so I have this placed onto some black cardstock that I prepped with an anti-static powder tool. And I'm inking up my sentiment in some white pigment ink. Then I'm going to sprinkle on some Gilded gold embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, tap off any of the excess, and that embossing powder is going to stick really well to the white pigment ink. Then after I heat set this, I have a really great trick. I'm just taking a pencil eraser, one of these large ones, and I'm buffing over my sentiment. This really takes off a lot of that excess powder that's left behind. Also included in the coordinating die set for the holiday envelopes is this banner die. So I line that up over my sentiment and I'm going to trim that out. But I personally like flat edges on the end of my sentiment, so I'm just trimming off those banners. Now back to my card front, I added foam tape behind my envelope to help pop that up on the front of the card. And I'm also going to add a little bit of foam tape to my bow and add that to the bottom of my envelope. And since my sentiment is on black cardstock, I added black foam squares behind the sentiment and added this towards the bottom. Now I have just a couple finishing touches, and that is adding some of this unicorn stickles to the center of my poinsettias. And then I'm taking a white gel pen and adding these kind of highlight areas to my bow. You don't necessarily need these, but I thought it was a nice touch. So that finishes up my card project for you today. I really like how I have kind of that frosted look on my pine needles using that Snowfall Grit Paste. I will have all of my supplies listed down below in the video description and over on my blog as well. And be sure to check out the rest of the Pretty Pink Posh holiday release because there are a ton of amazing products. Thanks for watching.